The rosary that could not be touched by those who broke promises. Would you believe me if I told you that a simple rosary could silence someone's voice forever? Henrique thought it was just an old object, kept by family tradition. But what he didn't know is that the rosary carried a pact made over a century ago, and that anyone who broke a promise and touched it would pay a price. 2 days after holding the rosary, Henrique completely lost his voice, and he began writing sentences in languages he'd never learned, sentences no one could understand, until they discovered he was being used as a conduit. But by whom or why? If this already gave you goosebumps, imagine what's yet to come. So leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and get ready for a story where even silence says more than it seems. In a small rural town where time seemed to stand still, there lived a family with deep roots in faith. For over 150 years, they guarded a sacred object, an antique rosary, locked in a dark wooden safe and hidden within the chapel on the family estate. The object was surrounded by an ancient history passed down from generation to generation, but which, over the years, began to be forgotten. Legend had it that the rosary had belonged to a nun who died in a state of grace, and before passing she sealed it with a promise that the object could never be touched by anyone who had betrayed their faith or broken a spiritual promise. But the younger generations were no longer interested in the stories. They found them exaggerated, superstitious, and even a source of ridicule. Henrique, a distant relative, came to spend a few days at the house after years away from the family. Curious, he explored the old rooms and eventually found the safe. He didn't know the full story, nor the warning written in faded letters on the lid. Only pure hands can touch what has been sealed by faith. Henrique opened the safe. He saw the rosary, beautiful, intact despite the passage of time, with dark beads and a silver cross. Without thinking twice, he touched the object. A slight shock ran through his fingers, but he thought he imagined it. Little did he know that years before he had made a solemn promise to his grandfather on his deathbed, a promise he broke out of greed and self-interest. 2 days later, Henrique woke up silent. Literally, his voice was gone. He didn't cough, he didn't whisper. He tried to speak, scream, nothing. He was taken to the hospital. He underwent tests, no apparent physical cause. The doctors couldn't explain it. His voice was gone, as if it had been ripped away. The silence, however, wasn't the strangest part. A few days later, he began writing compulsively. He grabbed notebooks, pens, lipstick pens. He wrote on walls, on mirrors, even on his own arm. But they weren't ordinary words, phrases in languages he'd never learned, like ancient Latin, Hebrew, and Syriac. Words from prayers, excerpts from forgotten passages. Spiritual quotes no one fully understood. The family's great aunt, one of the few who still respected the legacy of faith, recognized some of the symbols. They were words that were also engraved on the rosary itself, but for decades no one had been able to read them. It was then that they decided to seek spiritual help. A medium was called in and, after an intense session, brought the revelation. The rosary had been sealed as a guardian of spiritual promises. When someone impure touched it, it became a channel for voices from other times. Henrique had opened a portal, and now it was filled with the souls of those who had been betrayed by broken promises within the family line. The only way to end the cycle, according to the medium, was for Henrique to fulfill his broken promise or make a new pact of redemption. Unable to speak, he was taken to his grandfather's tomb. There, he laboriously wrote a letter of forgiveness, sealing it with a drop of blood that ran from a small cut on his hand. The air seemed to have grown lighter in that moment. That night, Henrique spoke again, partially, but something remained different. During the early hours of the morning, he continued writing. Now, only one phrase repeated itself, in a handwriting different from his own. There are still those who don't keep their promises. The rosary was returned to the safe. Beside it, the family left a handwritten note. Do not touch. Promises carry weight. Since then, every day before the broken promise, the safe emits a barely audible sound, as if someone inside were praying. Henrique wasn't a man tied to tradition. Young, skeptical, and accustomed to the hectic pace of the city, he cared little for the family stories he occasionally heard at sporadic gatherings. When he learned that a distant part of his inheritance would take him to an old house in the countryside, belonging to relatives he barely knew, he thought it would be just another monotonous journey. Little did he know he was about to tamper with something that not even time dared to erase. The old Ramos family home was silent, smelled of old wood, and held an air of reverence that made any visitor uncomfortable for reasons they couldn't explain. In the main room, a bookshelf hid a small dark iron safe decorated with hand-carved religious symbols. Henrique, curious and practical, didn't hesitate when he saw that the lock was unlocked. He opened the safe. Inside, wrapped in a hand-embroidered cloth and visibly worn by time, was the rosary. A simple object at first glance, but with a peculiar shine to its beads. Henrique, unaware of its history, removed the rosary and examined it for a few seconds. He felt a slight tingling in his hands, almost like a weak electrical charge. He thought it was static. He returned the rosary to the safe, closed the lid, and went about his day without a care. 2 days later, he woke in a panic. He tried to call for help, but no words came out of his mouth. He was completely hoarse. He thought it might be laryngitis, perhaps something neurological. He rushed to doctors, had tests done. Nothing. No physical cause. No diagnosis. His voice had simply disappeared. The family, already suspicious, began to notice strange behavior. Henry spent hours writing compulsively. Walls, notebooks, even his own clothes began to be covered in indecipherable symbols and phrases. One day, a priest was called. He recognized passages in archaic Latin and ancient Hebrew, languages Henry had never studied. The phrases were all spiritual in nature, supplications, prayers, fragments of long-forgotten rituals. It was then that a great-aunt, one of the few who still took traditions seriously, remembered the rosary. She told Henrique, through notes and signs, the story of that object, an artifact sealed by a nun considered a saint for her unwavering faith. According to legend, anyone who had broken a spiritual promise should never touch it. Henrique, unknowingly, had done exactly that years before, when he swore to an uncle on his deathbed that he would look after the family's assets, but sold part of the inheritance for personal gain. The broken promise awakened something ancient, dormant. The rosary responded, not with violence, but with demand. A demand that had been going on for centuries. Henrique's silence was the echo of betrayal, and his hands now were instruments for making forgotten voices heard again. At the end of that month, the family gathered at their old house. The rosary was rewrapped in the embroidered cloth and returned to the safe with a new note glued to the inside of the lid. Do not touch. Promises are eternal. Henrique, though still speechless, stopped writing compulsively. But on nights with a full moon, the papers he left beside his bed would appear scrawled with words no one could translate, as if there was still something waiting to be fulfilled. Henrique wasn't close to his family. He lived far away, led a busy life, and had little contact with his older relatives. When he received an invitation to visit his paternal grandmother's old home in the countryside, he saw it as a chance to rest. The centuries-old mansion exuded history, with every corner harboring relics, yellowed photographs, and religious objects left as a reminder of a devout and disciplined lineage. But what he didn't know was that his destiny had already been written before his arrival. During the visit, while exploring his great-grandfather's old office, Henrique came across a safe built into the wall, covered by a small painting depicting a nun with a piercing gaze. The key hung curiously beside it, as if it were waiting for someone. Driven by pure curiosity and unaware of the legend of the forbidden rosary, he opened the safe. Inside, a dark wooden box, carved in the shape of a cross and bearing unknown symbols, held a rosary made of aged beads and an ornate silver cross. Without hesitation, he touched it. The moment his fingers wrapped around the beads, a shiver ran down his spine. His hands went numb for a few seconds, followed by a slight twinge in the back of his neck. Henrique shook his head, trying to dispel the discomfort, and ignored the sensation. He put the rosary back and closed the safe. To him, it was all just a silly superstition. But that very night, a strange silence fell over the house. The next morning, Henry woke up feeling suffocated. He tried to call out, but no words came out. His voice had simply disappeared. Panicked, he ran to the mirror and tried to articulate sounds. Nothing. He opened his mouth, moved his lips, but no sound came out. Relatives rushed him to the hospital, where doctors found no explanation for his sudden vocal blockage. No injuries, no infections, no apparent causes. The diagnosis was vague, psychogenic mutism, a medical term that explained absolutely nothing. In the following days, Henrique's behavior began to change. He became more introspective, slept little, and spent hours writing on paper, notebooks, and even on the walls of his room. The strangest thing was that he wrote in languages no one understood. Some words were identified by an aunt who studied theology, passages in ancient Latin, archaic Hebrew, and Syriac, dead languages used in rituals and forgotten sacred texts. He wrote phrases like pactum fractum est, the pact is broken, and rede fidem tuam, give back your faith. His aunt, horrified, remembered the story her grandmother had, who whispered that rosary had been sealed with spiritual promises and only those with pure souls could touch it without consequences. Henrique, for his part, kept a secret. Years before, he had made a promise on a cousin's deathbed and broken it out of financial greed. Now, speechless, possessed by words that weren't his, and trapped in a spiral of spiritual messages, Henrique began to understand. By playing the rosary, he had awakened not only the curse, but the realization of a broken ancestral pact, and this was only the first consequence. 2 days after the incident, Henrique woke up feeling strange. He tried to call for his mother, but no words came out. It wasn't a sore throat, it wasn't hoarseness, it was absolute silence. A suffocating emptiness filled every attempt at sound. His muscles worked, his throat contracted, but no voice came out. Desperation filled his expression as he gestured uselessly. The family thought it was an anxiety attack. They took him to the hospital, and a series of tests began. CT scans, MRIs, neurological evaluations, and laryngeal exams. Everything was completely normal. No nodules, no infections, no explanation. Henrique was officially healthy, but mute. In the early days, he communicated with pen and paper, writing short sentences to make himself understood. However, as time passed, his writing began to change. Curved, elaborate letters with unusual strokes. He wrote without thinking, and they were no longer his own words. Religious passages, names of people his family didn't know, entire sentences in different languages. One night, his mother found scrawled on the bedroom wall, "Ego sum vox prometium fractorum." No one there spoke Latin, but a great-aunt became suspicious and sought help from a local priest. The translation was grim, "I am the voice of broken promises." From then on, the writing intensified. Henrique wrote in his sleep with his eyes half open. Paper, walls, the bathroom mirror, the hallway floor, everything became a surface for messages. The most frightening detail was that Henrique had never studied any ancient language. However, messages emerged in archaic Hebrew, Greek, and even Syriac. Consulted experts confirmed that some passages were forgotten prayers or fragments of spiritual scriptures that were not even publicly available. The family panicked. Doctors were at a loss for what to do. A linguist spent days analyzing the writings and noticed they all shared a common structure. They spoke of loyalty, sacrifice, broken faith, and pleas for redemption. It was at this point that Henrique's grandmother, the last guardian of the Rosary's history, decided to tell all. She revealed that the Rosary had been sealed with a ritual performed by a spiritualist nun in the 19th century. The condition was clear. Whoever broke a spiritual promise and touched the object would become an instrument for the souls still awaiting justice. Henrique, by breaking the pact made years earlier with a dying relative, had activated the Rosary's curse. Now, Henry's silence was not a punishment, but an exchange. His voice had been taken to give voice to those silenced by lies and betrayal. The price of an unfulfilled promise had become an eternal channel for laments from other eras, and that was just the beginning. Because according to the nuns' records, anyone who tried to silence these voices would suffer along with them. 2 days after playing the Rosary, Henrique woke with a strange, heavy feeling in his chest. When he tried to say good morning to his cousin, he couldn't make a sound. He tried to cough, clear his throat, but his voice had simply disappeared. Despair set in quickly. He thought it was an anxiety attack, a sudden problem with his vocal cords, but he felt no pain, just silence. The family rushed him to the hospital. Tests were performed, an MRI, an endoscopy, hearing and voice tests. No doctor could identify any physical abnormalities. Everything was normal. There was no reason for him to be mute, and this only increased everyone's unease, except Henrique, who was starting to panic inside. On the second day, without a voice, the first sign appeared. He scribbled, almost in a trance, the word promise on a sheet of paper. No one understood. He himself seemed to have no memory of writing it. After that, he began writing more frequently. He would pick up random sheets of paper, bathroom walls, even napkins, and on them would appear disjointed sentences, sometimes complete, sometimes interrupted. But something stood out. The phrases weren't in Portuguese, nor did they seem coherent with any language anyone in the house knew. An older aunt, who had been a nun in her youth, recognized words in archaic Latin, words like votum, vow, promise, and fidus fracta, broken faith, appeared repeatedly. Henrique had never studied Latin, nor did he know anything about Hebrew or Syriac, languages that experts later identified in the writings. He was reproducing passages from forgotten prayers, some from mystical manuscripts, others related to ancient penitential rituals. The writing appeared as if someone were dictating it directly into his mind. Unable to express himself verbally, he was now a channel, a mute body, but with hands possessed by a memory that wasn't his, and each new day brought more complex messages, as if the source behind the writing was using Henrique to revive fragments of a forgotten past. It was at this point that one of the older aunts decided to reveal the full truth. Henrique, still young, had made a promise to his dying grandfather, a promise to guard and protect a sacred family symbol. This promise was broken when he sold part of the inherited assets without telling the rest. The Rosary, then, was more than a sacred object. It was the seal of that oath, still valid in the spiritual realm. Henrique's silence wasn't a physical punishment, but rather an energetic reflection of the weight of his failure. And the messages that surfaced were ancestral voices crying out for the repair of the broken alliance. He wasn't just being punished, he was being used as a bridge between the world of the living and the world of forgotten promises. Henrique's persistent silence was no longer just a medical problem. It was a warning. With each passing day, the atmosphere in the house changed. It was as if the presence of something invisible grew stronger. The rooms seemed colder. The safe, even locked, sometimes trembled, slightly, as if the Rosary inside was trying to communicate. Henrique's compulsive writing intensified. There was no longer any control. He wrote on the walls, on the doors, on the curtains, phrases in forgotten languages and symbols no one recognized. At night, you could hear the drag of his pen on paper before he even woke up. Desperate, Great Aunt Rosa, the last of the lineage who still respected the traditions, decided to act. She knew the stories, the ancient pacts, and knew this was no coincidence. She then sought out an old family friend, Father Miguel, a religious man who also studied spiritual manifestations and mystical symbolism. He went to Henry's house without hesitation. Upon seeing the writings on the walls, he paled. That's Syriac, and that's Coptic. Their languages are very ancient sacred texts, he murmured. Miguel spent hours analyzing the writings and annotating passages. Silently, he took Rosa aside and showed her one of the translated texts. It was a warning. He who breaks the bond of the sacred will be a bridge for those who cry out for reparation. The priest understood that Henrique had become a channel. It wasn't just possession nor punishment. It was as if spiritual voices from past generations were using Henrique to manifest themselves, seeking justice or reconnection. Father Miguel then suggested a prayer session with elements of exorcism, not to expel, but to understand. During the rite, Henrique fell into a trance. His eyes were open, but he seemed to be unable to see. No words came from his mouth, but his hands were writing a long, flowing letter in ancient Hebrew. The translation came later. We did not come to harm, we came to remember. What was promised in the light never fades in the shadows. Miguel explained to the family that the Rosary, as a sacred channel, carried not only a blessing, but also an ancient spiritual covenant. Someone, generations ago, had promised something profound: to keep the faith and protect the spiritual lineage. By breaking this, Henrique became the exposed link, and the voices were merely exacting the price of the break. It was then that Rosa revealed something to everyone. Before she died, the nun who blessed the Rosary left a manuscript. Within it was a prayer for sealing the bridge. It was used to restore the connection between the spirit world and the living, but it could only be recited before the object and by a pure member of the lineage. Hope was rekindled, but the ritual would require more than words. It would require sincere repentance, public confession, and a willingness to bear the burden of forgiveness, something only Henry could decide, if there was still time. The silence that dominated Henrique's house wasn't just due to the absence of his voice. It was as if something there was suspended in time. The atmosphere had changed. Some plants began to wilt for no reason. The living room clock stopped at 11:45 p.m. every day, and the feeling of a presence was constant. Faced with the inexplicable events and Henrique's compulsive writing in forgotten languages, the family decided to seek spiritual help. His great-aunt, who had already recognized some phrases among the obsessive scribbles, suggested a well-known medium in the region. He was respected for dealing with spiritual objects and cases where energetic inheritance seemed to affect descendants. Reluctantly, Henrique's parents agreed. The session was scheduled for a rainy Saturday night when the sky seemed to weigh down the house as much as the secrets of the lineage. During the ritual, the medium lit special incense and asked for complete silence. Henrique, lying on the sofa, seemed in a trance, eyes half open, breathing calmly, but without blinking. As he touched the rosary with special gloves, the medium stiffened and began speaking in a raised voice. This rosary is not a symbol of faith. It is a seal of penance, made to contain the pain of forgotten promises. The channel has opened. The voice said that Henrique had not been chosen by chance, but because his bloodline required redemption. The spirit that sealed the rosary, according to the embodied entity, was that of a nun who had been betrayed by a family member in the 19th century. She had blessed the object so that every time someone with an impure heart touched it, it would serve as a channel for the laments of others who had also suffered from broken promises. The bond remains as long as the pain is not mended. It writes what has been erased from the memory of men. It writes in ancient names, for words still have owners, said the voice. The entire family watched in shock, especially when Henry, still with his eyes closed, began moving his fingers as if writing in the air. The medium concluded the session by saying that the only way to ease the flow was if Henrique understood the origin of the broken promise and somehow tried to reconnect this spiritual alliance. As long as he is a channel, it won't just be his own soul that speaks, but the pain of all who have been betrayed by words thrown to the wind. It was recommended that the rosary be placed back in storage, but now wrapped in a red prayer blanket, and that only one person in the family should have the key to the safe. No one but them should know what had happened, or the energy would spread even further. The revelation left the family divided between skepticism and fear. But that night, for the first time in weeks, Henry slept peacefully, without writing, without stirring. However, his great-aunt had a dream, and in it she saw the nun sitting at the foot of the bed, murmuring a Latin phrase that only she would understand upon waking. It was a prayer, but not a prayer of peace. It was a reminder: the forgotten promise will be remembered, always. Henrique's silence was no longer the greatest mystery. What most disturbed the family was what he wrote: old prayers, forgotten verses, words in languages that barely existed anymore, and it was all done compulsively, as if guided by an invisible force. Faced with despair, a great-aunt remembered something that would change the course of that story: the promise Henrique had made to his father years before, when he was on the brink of death. At the time, Henrique had promised to care for his younger brother and maintain the family unity. However, out of pride and self-interest, he distanced himself and severed ties with his brother. The breaking of this promise, though ignored by him for years, seemed to have been the trigger for everything that was happening. It was then that a local medium, known for dealing with cases of spiritual obsession and family karma, was called in. In an intense session, in the presence of everyone, the medium entered a trance and revealed a direct message. Henrique had awakened a karmic line by breaking a blood pact, and the rosary, sealed for generations, recognized and reacted to this kind of spiritual betrayal. To end this cycle, Henrique had to reconnect with the one he betrayed. Forgiveness wasn't just spiritual, it had to be human. Even speechless, Henrique demonstrated his understanding. He was then taken to the countryside where his brother lived. After years of silence and distance, the two came face to face. In tears, Henrique wrote there, in front of everyone, "Forgive me, I broke everything, but I want to fix it." His brother, visibly touched, hugged him, and something strange happened at that moment. Henrique uttered one word: "Thank you." It was the first time his voice had spoken since the day he rang the rosary. That night, the house where they were staying fell completely silent. No compulsive writing, no noise coming from the safe, no strange prayers. The rosary, tucked away again, seemed finally asleep. However, even with his speech partially restored, Henrique continued to write, albeit less frequently. He kept a notebook where he recorded dreams and phrases that came to mind at dawn. When asked why he continued, he wrote, "Some promises echo beyond time. I can only guarantee that this time I will fulfill each one." The safe, however, remains locked, and everyone in the family now knows this was no ordinary relic. It was a living reminder that in the spirit world, words carry weight, and promises exact a price. After the symbolic delivery of the letter and the silent prayer said beside their relative's grave, the family anxiously awaited any sign of improvement in Henrique. That morning was the first in days, without strange noises coming from his room. In the morning, he emerged from his room with a calmer face, though his eyes still carried an immeasurable weight. He sat at the table with his family, looked at everyone, and for the first time made a sound, a small whisper. It wasn't quite a sentence, but the effort was real. Everyone looked at each other. It was a beginning. Over the next few days, speech gradually returned. Short words, spaced phrases, until one day Henrique said clearly, "I hear fewer voices now." This brought relief and unease at the same time. The hope that the worst was over was shattered when, that same night, Henrique's mother woke to a sound coming from the office. Turning on the light, she found her son asleep on the desk, with dozens of sheets of paper filled with strange words, circular symbols, and prayers that seemed to come from another time. Even unconscious, Henrique continued writing. According to a specialist, it was as if a spiritual breach had been opened, and he had become a partial channel, a still active bridge between the visible and invisible worlds. Despite partially recovering his speech, the nocturnal habit persisted. There was no violence, no pain, but a kind of gentle, inexplicable compulsion. Curiously, when morning came, he remembered nothing. And even more intriguing, the writings were all in extinct or sacred languages. One of the aunts, a scholar of Christian symbolism, found a quote on one of the sheets that sent chills down her spine. It was a forgotten variation of a prayer of renunciation used by ancient 15th century monks, aimed at forgiving broken pacts. The coincidence was too disturbing to ignore. The family then decided to return the rosary to its original safe. With extreme care, they performed a new ritual, sealing it again with a collective prayer. Henrique participated in silence, but at the end, he asked for a piece of paper and wrote, "Promises have echoes. Don't treat them like wind." Since then, he only writes during a few specific mornings each year, mostly on the date the promise was made. The safe remains closed with the rosary intact and a new warning: do not touch. Promises have weight and memory. The most disturbing thing is that even without being touched, some nights are marked by a faint noise coming from the safe. As if, on the other side of the ancient wood, someone still whispers prayers that have never been forgotten. The cycle seems dormant, but not finished. And every year, on that same date, Henry remains awake, as if he knows that the voices, though silent, have never completely gone away. The morning was eerily silent in the house. After everything Henrique had been through, the loss of speech, the messages written in forgotten languages, and the symbolic ritual of redemption, a dense peace seemed to have taken over the room. But it was a fragile peace, like the muffled sound before. A storm. The family, marked by fear and renewed respect for the sacred object, decides to reseal the rosary in the old safe, as it had been done for generations. The safe is locked with a double key, now kept by two different family members in different cities. The note accompanying the rosary, now restored and written in red letters on aged paper, simply says, "Do not touch. Promises carry weight." In the days that followed, Henrique seemed partially recovered. His speech had returned, but his voice sounded different, hoarser, more measured. He no longer spoke much, only the essentials. However, at night, even while asleep, he continued writing. He would wake up to sentences scrawled on sheets of paper, walls, and mirrors, words he himself didn't understand. Some were later identified by scholars as verses from lost scriptures or rituals sealed by extinct religious orders. The family, fearing for their sanity, considers a new spiritual cleansing process. But the priest they consulted denies it, saying the case isn't one of possession, but of channeling. Henrique was now like a spiritual link between times and broken promises, a living bridge to ancestral pain. On the eve of the anniversary of the broken promise, the same day Henrique had rang the rosary, the locked safe emits a noise, as if someone were praying inside. A muffled rhythmic whisper, repeating the same Latin words Henrique wrote in the early hours. The grandmother, now one of the key's guardians, prays beside the cabinet, weeping softly. She knows something has been sealed, but not destroyed. Forgiveness may alleviate, but never completely erase the debt. That same night, a candle that had been unlit for years inside the house's chapel lights up on its own. Henrique, his eyes closed, says softly, he accepted, but he didn't forget. The next day, the writing stops. Silence returns, the safe remains closed, and the note is reinforced with another note, this time signed by Henrique. Only those who keep their promises should open it. The story becomes a living legend among descendants, a warning passed down from generation to generation. On every eve of that day, the family prays together, not out of fear, but out of respect, out of awareness of the weight a broken promise can carry, even across centuries. And always, whenever someone new enters the family, a single recommendation is given. Never touch the rosary, unless you have nothing to hide.